My name is Colleen King, and I am director of the Richard and Leslie Frank Center for Leadership and Innovation in Media. And we are thrilled to have you all here with us tonight in person and via Zoom. Rich and Leslie, I think, are with us remotely tonight as well from California, and we are so grateful for their support and their desire to honor the best and brightest in journalism. Our guest tonight represents the highest quality of reporting and innovation in journalism, and a homecoming for an Illinois alum. Eli Murray, a 2015 graduate of Sauk Valley Community College, was a transfer student here and a journalism major here at Illinois. And as a student here in Champaign-Urbana, he taught himself to code, and he worked for the Daily Alumni. After graduating, he made his way south, where he interned on the data team at the Tampa Bay Times. And then in fewer than 7 years, Eli Murray would win the Pulitzer Prize. Eli and his colleagues Corey Johnson and Rebecca Woolington initially began reporting on lead levels in the water near Tampa, but they stumbled upon a much bigger story. 18 months, thousands of documents, and more than 80 interviews later, their expose on a lead factory would earn them journalism's top prize for investigative reporting. And you'll hear all about that in just a moment. Interviewing Eli tonight will be a former professor of his, Charles Stretch Ledford. Professor Ledford, an associate professor in journalism, came to Illinois after a distinguished career in photojournalism. His work has been featured by the Associated Press, the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, the BBC, and he too is a former Tampa Bay Times intern. Towards the end of the hour, we'll open this up for questions for all of you here in the room and on Zoom. But in the meantime, without further ado, I'd like to introduce it to you, Pulitzer Prize winner Eli Murray and Professor Stretch Ledford.
I want to take care of one piece of housekeeping. I think Eli deserves a round of applause just for what he's done. Let's give Eli a round of applause. Another piece of housekeeping, I think we ought to recognize we have one other Pulitzer Prize winner. At least there's only one other that I know of in the room. Professor Leon Dash, winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 1995. And I think it's also important to recognize that no work of this level happens. No one can do work of this level without a support system. In particular, without one person maybe who is there behind the scenes who supports this kind of work through the days and weeks and months, long hours. So Eleanor Black, Eli's partner.
We met at the DI, at a DI party.
There you go. Join the DI.
Might find love.
So I asked Leon in preparing for this, what may have changed for him when he won the Pulitzer Prize. And he says from at that moment he knew what the lead in his obituary would be. So you now know that. And Leon said either the lead or the second graph. It will be right up there. Not a lot of us know that at this age. But you came to Illinois as a transfer student, right? Why did you choose Illinois? What was it that interested you here at Illinois? And what was the experience of coming to campus as a transfer student?
Yeah. So the reason I chose Illinois was because I am from Illinois, and it was the University of Illinois. My cousins also went here, and so had some family ties to that. But actually, right out of high school, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I thought I might want to pursue journalism, but I wanted a little bit more time to make that decision before I was paying $30,000 a year to come here. So I went to Sauk Valley Community College, got my associate's degree, and by the end of that, I had decided that yes, I wanted to focus on journalism.
What was it like coming here to a four-year institution as a transfer student?
I felt a little bit like a fish out of water, just because my whole life I had grown up in a small town, rural Illinois, population 3,500, Oregon, Illinois. And so to come to a campus that was more than 10 times as big as my hometown I was very apprehensive about that. And then to come in as a transfer student, I felt like I had to do a lot of learning and growing in a short period of time at U of I.
In what way?
Well, one of the things that I really took advantage of while I was here was finding something that I was passionate in and then sharing that with my professors who would help me to build projects around, what I was passionate in and independent studies and that sort of thing. So I kept very busy in that sense in learning, and I had a full class schedule. So that I remember very, very vividly my first semester here, feeling very out of place and then just drowning myself in work to sort of.
And you roomed with some freshmen, I think, as a junior. Is that right?
I did.
You missed part of you missed the orientation experience that they had, however.
Yes,
right?
yes. So they put me in at the 6-pack, and because I was a transfer student, I had to actually take some classes during the summer, so I hadn't fully applied until late. So I was late to get in. I was put in Weston, which was at that time the worst dorm. I think it has air conditioning now, but it didn't when I was there. And they put me in a room with there was 5 of us in one room. It was like an overflow room. And so I was there for a few months. But because it was the 6-pack in the freshman dorms, all of the freshmen got invited for orientation week. But because I was a transfer student, I didn't know anyone. So I definitely felt a bit of a fish out of water there.
Well, you found your place eventually through the DI and the journalism
Yes.
department, et cetera, et cetera. What interested you in journalism to begin with? You shared a story about your high school teacher. How did your interest in journalism start? And then was there any question when you had to declare a major that it would be journalism? Did you consider anything else?
In high school, I was really into English classes. I imagine that some of you journalism students out there are in a similar boat. In high school, I thought I wanted to be a writer because I really enjoyed reading. But I had one teacher in high school who I took a philosophy class with him, and he taught us a lot to think about how we know anything. We talked about Plato and the allegory of the cave. We watched The Matrix, and we watched All the President's Men. And we really dived into finding truth and how do we know what's true and convey that it's true and support that in that class. And so that really gave me my first sort of introduction to journalism. And like I said, I went to community college. It wasn't certain I wanted to do journalism, but by the time I finished that, I realized that that's what I would focus on here.
So let's talk about the series. It's a 3-part series. I heard someone say 6-part, but I thought it was a 3-part series, right?
3-part series, but had 24 follow-ups.
Okay.
Afterward, yeah.
Okay.
And reactions.
Okay. So first of all, the title, Poisoned. It's compelling. It's clear, concise. It's easy to remember. How did you guys come up with that, and why?
One of the things that I've learned in being at the Times and working on a few projects is like coming up with the title and the headline for the project is a big deal. And they like to get, especially if it's a big project, they like to get everyone involved. From the reporters to the editors to the top editors. And so for this, it was always a collaboration where everyone was expected to brainstorm ideas. And I don't remember who pitched Poison, but it was very early on that someone pitched Poison, and we all knew that that was the story, that was the title of the series, because that was the story. It is so clear that that is exactly what the company was doing to those workers.
So let's talk about the workers. Tell us about the workers who this company, Gopher Industries, was poisoning.
The workers that work there, a lot of them work there because they felt like they didn't have a whole lot of other options where they could make that kind of money, especially because a lot of them didn't have an education. There was a lot of immigrants. There was a big Haitian community. A lot of the workers didn't speak English, and they only spoke Creole. And so that made them, it put them in a more vulnerable position to be taken advantage of. And then the other aspect of it is that a lot of the workers might have a criminal record and where they couldn't go get a sort of high-paying job anywhere else. This factory was paying them, $20 an hour or around there, and then they got essentially unlimited overtime. So they really got to have paychecks that these men had never expected that they would get in their lives. And that was really sort of I want to say it was something that we butt up against a lot when we were talking to the workers, because this was their livelihood. And even though they recognized the dangers of it, or maybe they weren't fully ready to recognize the dangers of it, it was their job. And they knew that they weren't going to get as good of a paying job easily if this job wasn't there for them.
And the company that owned Gopher Industries, the holding company, has a similar plan, a lead smelter. A lead smelter is you want to describe what a lead smelting, in this case, what a lead smelter does first?
Yeah, so Gopher is a secondary lead smelter, which means that they recycle old used lead. And in this case, they work primarily with old car batteries. So they'll bring them in, they'll crack them open, take the lead out, and then melt it down and get any of the impurities out of it. And then they'll put it into an ingot, and then they'll sell that to like an ammo manufacturing company.
So for bullets, ammunition, like
Right.
for hunting or whatever.
Correct.
Okay. So this company had another similar plant in Minnesota, I
Yes,
believe it was?
Egan, Minnesota.
How did these two, the facility in Minnesota is much different than the one in Tampa. And the workforce in Egan is much different than the one in Tampa. Could you talk a little bit about that dichotomy?
Yeah, because I think that this is one of the most important points of the story here. The factory in Tampa wasn't dirty because there's no other way to have a lead factory. The lead factory in Egan, Minnesota was clean. It was also a unionized workforce, and it was the area where the company headquarters was based. And so for those reasons, it had a lot more oversight than the Tampa factory. The Tampa factory, compared to the Egan factory, employees that had seen both would joke that you could eat off the floor of the Egan factory.
And the demographic of the workers.
And it was much whiter in Minnesota than in Tampa, for sure.
So this isn't necessarily a dirty job. It's a hard job. It's a difficult job. It's a dangerous job. But the scenes inside this factory that y'all were able to obtain from videos and photographs that the workers made, it was unbelievable. You want to try and describe what some of those what you were seeing?
Yeah, one of probably the most striking sort of videos that we saw. This is actually on the front page of the first story. There's a worker there, and he tosses a rock up against the wall. There's like kind of a ledge there where some dust had sat, and when he throws it up there, an avalanche of lead dust comes down. It hits the floor, and then it just puffs up around him and engulfs the guy. And yeah, the first time we saw that, we were like, the person who showed it to us explained to us that's lead dust that was just left on the wall there waiting to avalanche, at the slightest provocation. And then we saw a bunch of other, as we worked on it, we got many other videos. We saw videos of ventilation pipes that were malfunctioning and just like belching fumes out into the area where the forklift drivers were driving around. We found there are photos and videos of piles of lead sort of slag and leftover lead dust mixed with battery acid into sort of mud cake consistency, just all over covering this plant. And then in the furnace room, we have videos and pictures of when they're running the furnaces and the lead dust is escaping out and it's coming out. It's like whiteout conditions. If the worker had held their hand out in front of the video camera, you wouldn't have been able to see it. And that's just some of the conditions that we saw, not having entered the factory ourselves at all.
Yeah, you couldn't get in, right? You couldn't,
Correct.
and you couldn't get documents from the factory. You couldn't get a comment other than some very cursory statements from the company or their attorneys. How did you go about? Well, let's back up. How did this start? What was the first? When did you first hear about, and from whom did you hear about that there's something going on over, on the east side of Tampa that we need to look at?
Mm-hmm. Corey and I had, at that point, we had been working. This was, I I think it was in 2018 or so, we had been working on a series of stories about lead in the drinking water at the schools, at the school district in Tampa. And while we were working on those stories, a source had sent Corey a report. It was called Florida Morbidity Statistics. And this report lists a bunch of reportable diseases and statistics about them in Florida. And the source had earmarked a page on lead poisoning in there. And when we opened up the report to the page on lead poisoning, we were struck by how high Tampa's rate of lead poisoning was. And then the other interesting thing that struck us about it was that there was a lot of adult cases of lead poisoning, which is sort of rare because adults aren't the people you're normally testing for their blood lead levels. It's usually something you test in kids, and the majority of the database that's collected on these things comes from kids on Medicaid. So it's pretty rare to be testing adults for their blood lead level at all, let alone be finding such a large number of them. And on the report, one of the things that it said was that the author attributed it to battery recyclers in the area. And that's really all we had to go off of to start.
And so then you Googled battery recyclers in Hillsborough County, and one plant came up, and that was Gopher, right?
There was a couple, but Gopher's the only one that did the smelting as well.
Okay.
So they were the largest, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about lead? I mean, lead used to be in our gasoline. It used to be in our paint. It's still in the paint of older buildings below any number of other levels of paint. But it can profoundly affect children, in particular their development. It persists. It doesn't. I don't know. You could share about what do we need to know about lead?
Lead is the one thing that we know about lead now more than ever is that there is no place for lead in the human body. Your body can do nothing good with lead. Any amount of lead is bad for you because your body mistakes it for calcium because chemically they're quite similar. So your body thinks it's calcium and it starts sending it into your bones to store in your bones. For the most part, if it's on your bones, it can make them more brittle, but the real damage comes later in life as you get older and you start to lose bone density. It's re-released back into your bloodstream and it can damage your organs. Lead can damage just about every system in the body, but what makes it so insidious for children is because the body mistakes it as calcium, it goes straight to the brain because the nervous system and calcium is incredibly important in setting in a growing brain and in the growing nervous system. So that is why it is so dangerous for children. And I had an expert explain it to us that one coffee grain of lead, if you think of like a coffee ground, and you get one of those, if that's lead and gets in a child, that's enough to cause permanent brain damage. And that would be kind of a large piece of lead, right? But even at low levels, lead is very dangerous. And I've had this explained to me this way. It sort of blunts a child's potential. If you think about all of humans' intelligence on a bell curve, it might slightly shift the bell curve a little bit to the left, a couple degrees. And so for one child, that might not seem like a big deal. But if you have thousands of kids at a low blood level, you're really bringing down the intelligence or the potential of everyone to sort of achieve everything they can. So that's what makes lead so scary and dangerous.
And you, if for any reason you wanted to give up journalism and have another career, you're now a certified lead inspector, I think, right? You want to talk to us about the Tampa Bay Times, facilitating that for you?
Yeah. So I told my editor while I was researching lead that I thought maybe we should go get the EPA training to become lead inspectors, and he said, "Sure, let's do it." It was actually February 2020. We flew to Georgia, to Atlanta, to take it was like a week-long course and then a couple exams. So I took that, Corey and Rebecca both took it. So we all got trained as lead inspectors and lead risk assessors. And then we flew back to Tampa, and then 2 weeks later, everything shut down for COVID. And we had originally wanted to do lead inspections of some of the houses of the workers and the people in the community, but with COVID, that was not an option. But it was still helpful for us to have that training because we used it later when we did some soil sampling, and just the background technical knowledge of how that works and how the regulations work was incredibly helpful.
I understand that soil sampling can be dangerous in Florida due to the flora and fauna.
Yes, absolutely. So as part of this project, we had thought we wanted to see if we could detect any lead from the factory nearby. And so I had mapped out the factory, and then I set rings around it at 500 meters, increasing out around the factory. And then I drew lines through it, and where the lines intersected with the rings, we put a dot, and that's where we would go sample. So I ended up taking 70 soil samples, and it took about 2 weeks or so. And when I was out there in the middle of it at one point, I wanted to go get a sample along the canal, which ran near Gopher. And there's a little park there. And when I was out there taking the sample, I thought, well, I want to get as close to the water as possible because I don't have any other samples near water, so this will give me a sample near water. And I had these strings, and I set them out. They were like 1 meter in length. I set them out as a cross, and then I could take a composite sample where you get a scoop from all quadrants of where you mark it with the strings. And maybe I'm getting too technical here, but so I'm really absorbed with taking the sample. All right, it's important to me. I want to do it right. And there's these joggers running by, ladies with strollers, and this one lady turns to me and she goes, "You're too close." And I was, at first I wasn't certain she was talking to me, and I was just hoping she wasn't. Like, lady, leave me alone and let me take my soil sample. It's hot and I want to get out of here. But she said it again, and I looked up to her and I said, "What do you mean? Like, I'm not going to fall into the water here, and I know how to swim, so it'll be okay." And she goes, "No, you're too close to the gator." And I kid you not, from me to you over there on the corner desk, there was a gator sitting out in the sun, 20 feet away from me.
So we'll come back to the soil samples in the neighborhood, but at what point did you all realize? I don't think anyone starting a story like this that becomes something as consuming as this has been, and that's had the impact that this has had, and has gotten the recognition that this has had. I don't think that often one realizes that at the beginning of the process. You're doing your job. This is an assignment that's come in along with other assignments, other projects that you're working on, I would suspect. But you tell the story of when you and Corey and Rebecca, when the three of you realized that we're onto something here. Mm-hmm. Could you share that?
Yeah, really early on in the reporting, it was at this point we'd already had the morbidity statistics from the source. We had figured out that gopher was this problem, and now it was time to go talk to some people that worked there. And we started by looking at people who had filed workers' compensation claims against the company, and in talking to those people, they had one person had come up. They said, "We should go talk to this guy who was a former furnace manager at the plant. And he had a son who has autism, and this man is convinced that the lead played a role in his son's medical issues." And so we get the guy's address, and we all hop in Rebecca's car and drive out 45 minutes outside of Tampa to this nice little subdivision with some nice big houses. It was all pretty new. And we walk up to the door and we knock on it, and a woman answers the door. And we were looking for a guy, so we weren't sure if we were in the right spot, but we introduced ourselves and we said, "Hi, we're, Corey, Rebecca, and Eli. We're here from the Tampa Bay Times. We're doing a story on the lead smelter, and we're hoping to talk to Co Brown about this." And immediately this woman burst into tears. I have not seen someone go from 0 to 100 like that so quickly, because right away she recognized that someone was interested in hearing her story, in hearing her personal struggles, and something that she dealt with every day. And so she invited us in, and when we stepped inside, she showed us on her counter was a stack of medical records from her lead-poisoned son. And all of us at that moment realized sort of the gravity of the situation, why we were doing this story now. Because she didn't have those records out because she knew some reporters were coming by and wanted to see them. She had those records out because every single day, that was her life. Fighting for her son, for his appointments, for his care, for his for him to even have a normal schooling life, because this affected everything for this child. And then on top of that, to hear from her, not only was her son lead poisoned, but her husband was lead poisoned. And to see how it affected her family, it made it very real for us. And it was a moment that I personally kept coming back to as we were working on this story, and maybe feeling exhausted in the middle of the pandemic, feeling helpless, feeling like there was no end in sight. Coming back to that moment really helped focus me on why we were telling the story.
So how did you and Rebecca and Corey divide up the workload? You each have particular areas of expertise, but you came together in collaboration with one another and produced something that I would suspect that each of you would admit that none of the three of you could have done on your own. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It was key to have a team for this project, for this story. Rebecca is a fantastic writer. Rebecca might be one of the best investigative but narrative writers in the country at this point. I really think that she's someone special there. And on top of that, she's a fantastic reporter. So she was actually the anchor on our story. She wrote everything. And Corey and my job was to do our parts of the reporting and to feed it back to her. Corey handled working with the workers and working the sources, because Corey is fantastic with people. And then I handled the data side of things, so managing all of the records that came in, and compiling them, and then figuring out what they said, and then doing graphics. And then also, all three of us in some way or another had hands in reporting out various parts along the way.
So in terms of the data reporting, how do you, I've never done it. I've worked with an Excel spreadsheet, but how do you take the quantity of data that you had and make sense of it?
Every data story is going to be different, but they all boil down to a few basic steps that you're going to hit in every one. You've got the step of gathering it, and that might be sending out FOIA requests, or in our case, we were going to workers and having them request their medical records from the company, and then they were handing them to us. So you've got to gather it all, then you have to clean it. So you have to get it all together into one spreadsheet, essentially, and you have to make sure you're not getting any duplicates. You have to make sure all the columns line up, all of that sort of tedious stuff. But once you've done that, you really get into the exploratory phase. And this is the part that I really enjoy to do. The cleaning is probably 75% of the work, but it's not fun at all. But the rest of it is fun. And so the exploratory phase, you can think of it kind of like you're hunting for pearls in oysters. And you're really just throwing up charts, cutting the data in different ways. What happens if you aggregate it by week, by month? Can I see some trends this way? Is there anything, any sort of trends you can find? That's really what you're looking for, is trends. And while you're hunting for those pearls, you might find a few trends or a few pearls that are worth highlighting. And then the final step is to compile it into a presentation that you can then make a point. So you've spent all this time hunting for pearls, but you better not just throw all of those empty oysters at your audience. You need to show them just the pearls. And that's the final step.
And so let's look at that from the side of of maybe what was more Corey's work, which was conducting interviews, et cetera, et cetera. Can you just share anything about from your perspective? How do you get people to open up? How do you establish a rapport with someone who doesn't know you from Adam, but you need them to trust you and confide in you, especially in a situation like this where trusting in you and confiding with you might put their job and their livelihood at risk?
That is a great question. I think it's one of the sort of key questions that issues that all of us face as journalists, is how do you connect with someone and get them to share with you their story and feel comfortable doing it? It's tough. It really is. And a lot of times when you meet someone new, the first thing you're going to notice are all of your differences. And what's important is to, first off, recognize that you're different because that's just the truth of it, but then to find that common ground. And it could be in pets, it could be in sports, it could be in cars, it could be literally anything. The truth of the matter is that we all have much, much more in common than we do different. And so if you can find those things, you can sort of bridge those gaps with reticent sources, and you can start to build that trust. The other side of it is that you just have to show up a lot. In this case, the factory was right in our backyard, and so all these guys lived nearby. And so Corey was there. He was out there talking to them. He was there around the clock, and that is how you make those sort of inroads.
So, Gopher this is a highly regulated industry. You want to talk about who regulates it? OSHA regulates it, and then there's local regulation. You want to just explain a little bit about what the regulations, what Gopher was supposed to be doing to meet the necessary. What am I trying to say?
Standards, the lead standards.
Yes, to stay below the lead standards.
Right. So there's really two bodies that sort of regulate this, the lead hazard in this industry. There's OSHA, which is Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they're in charge of anything safety related inside of the building. And then the other one is EPA, which is Environmental Protection Agency, which is in charge of everything lead related outside of the building that escapes. In the case of Florida, Florida does not have, Florida has a state-sent version of the EPA, which is called the DEP. And in fact, Hillsborough County has an even more local version called the EPC, which is the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County. And so they were in charge of regulating the quality of the air outside. They measure it and say that the amount of lead in the air has to be below a certain amount. And then OSHA was in charge of inside. And they're two different agencies, so they have different standards of what's required. So the levels inside are held to a different standard than the levels outside, for example.
So OSHA came in, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration came in, took some measurements. There was one incident where they were supposed to be measuring for sulfur dioxide, I believe. They instead measured for sulfuric acid and gave the factory a free pass. How else did the regulators either fall down on the job, or how else did Gopher play these regulators like a fiddle to slide through?
So one of the important things to understand about this factory is it's the only lead smelter in all of Florida, and it's one of 9 in the U.S. So it's pretty specialized work, and it requires you to have an understanding of the processes and how it all works to know where things can go wrong. And so one of the issues that OSHA had was that their inspectors didn't have the experience to find that out on their own. So they relied on the plant managers to show them through the factory. Well, the plant managers would pre-plan their routes. They would repaint the floors so everything looked nice and clean, and they would show them the cleanest areas of the factory. And so by no surprise that they got away with, or that OSHA never, fined them for that. And then outside of the factory, where the EPC would measure the air quality, they would measure it on a 6-day schedule. So every 6 days, they would turn the monitors on for 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, they'd collect the filter, measure all the lead, and then they would know how much lead had been in the air. Well, because it was on a 6-day schedule, the factory knew when they would have those monitors on. And so for them, they just developed a new set of practices on those days so that they could keep those emissions down. They had water misting cannons that we were told were used primarily for that reason, to keep the dust off the monitors. They kept the doors locked, and they would gas the vehicles up the night before and keep the doors closed so that no fugitive emissions were escaping. And we even had sources tell us, they would crank up production running into that day, and then leave it low on the day of the monitoring so that less lead was going to be picked up by those monitors outside.
I'm going to come back to the monitors in a moment, but how were the workers tested for lead levels, and how did they do whatever they could think of to keep their lead levels low?
So the workers had to do quarterly, I believe it was quarterly medical checkups where they'd get their blood drawn and the doctor would figure out their lead levels. And the company had a program in place to encourage the workers to keep their blood lead levels low. They would offer them bonuses if their blood lead level stayed below a certain range. And at the start, they would just do it. It was your blood lead level and your bonus. But over time, it became everyone in the department is bonus depends on the average of the department. And then they would post the people who had high blood levels, they would post them on signs around the factory. So now everyone knew who was causing everyone to miss their bonuses, and there became a huge sort of peer pressure element to it. It became so bad that a lot of the guys were willing to risk dangerous medical interventions to get rid of the lead. They did this process, it's called chelation, where they strip metals out of your blood, but they do it indiscriminately. So it's going to pull out iron and any other metals that your body actually needs to function. So it's quite dangerous. And then the one other thing that they ended up doing is some of them would even go and donate contaminated blood that had a lead level in it, which is frustrating because they don't screen for that stuff at the blood banks. And so as a result of this company's practices, the blood supply in Tampa was contaminated with lead. Potentially. I guess we didn't go test blood banks for lead. I should make that clear.
All right. So could you share about the meeting you had? It was, I believe, about a month before the first part of the project published. You met with the Florida Environmental Commission, I think it was, to lay your cards on the table. This is what is happening. This is what we've seen. You wanted to get their input, their comment, whatever it might have been. And could you share their reaction, both in the room and then moving forward to some of the stuff you revealed to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were there it was like a conference room kind of set up like a classroom, and we were in tables facing, like at a 90-degree angle, kind of facing each other. And we at the Times and most journalists have this rule, no surprises. You want to tell someone everything that you're going to write about them in the paper beforehand so that they're not surprised when it's in the paper, right? And so we wanted to tell them what we had found out about how the company was changing their practices on the days when the regulators actually monitored. And so we explained it to them. We showed them the photos we had of the schedule they had posted inside for air monitoring day, and we had talked about that. And the reaction, I'm not sure what I expected the reaction to be, but the reaction we got was they were like, I thought they might have something like that. But they hadn't really tested it. But after our story ran, so that story ran in December, and then by January, they had actually gone and updated their practices, so they're no longer sampling on that 6-day schedule. So now it is randomized. And it's actually like a pilot program. It's one of the only places, it might be the first place in the U.S. to do this random schedule. But what they found when they started doing it randomized, within 2 months, they found that the lead levels in the air around the factory were above the EPA standard for what's safe. And so they sent out a letter to all the people in the neighborhood that said, don't leave your house if you can help it. Like if you don't go outside as little as possible. And to me, that's one of the most proud moments for me, this part of the story, because it goes to show that this company had been getting away with it for decades. But within 2 months of switching to the random schedule, they'd been caught and it wasn't going to happen anymore. So something they'd been getting away with for so long can finally stop here.
Where do things stand now in terms of, the last segment of the story or the project published when?
The last piece published in December of 2021.
So where do things stand now in terms of fines, in terms of the first thing I think of thought of when I read this was like a class action lawsuit or something. Where do things stand either in terms of regulatory action or legal action for the company?
So right now, on both of those counts, it's still in the courts. As far as the regulatory fines go, the company and the regulators are arguing over the sort of the severity of the fines and the required fixes. Hopefully, we'll know more about that soon. I thought we might know more about that now, but not yet. And then what was the other question? Fines
and the legal, any lawsuits.
Right. So not as a result of the story, but just one of the things that happened after the story came out is one of the workers, actually the guy whose house we went to visit, and his wife met us at the door. He filed a lawsuit against the company, particularly focusing on the lead poisoning, the lead level that his son had. So that is they're still playing out, and I don't have a good sense of where that's going to land yet. But we've been told by the lawyers that once that sort of gets figured out, they're going to figure out what to do with the rest of the employees who came to them. And as we know, right now they're sort of I believe they're building a case for multiple other workers. But
so we're going to go to questions here in just a moment. I want to ask one more thing. Is a two-part question. One is after the Pulitzer was announced in May, late May or June, I think it was late May, wasn't it? Yep. May or early May, actually. What changed in terms of your role at the newspaper, if anything? Did you go back to work the next morning, per usual? And also, coming back to the present time, what do you have any big projects that you're working on right now?
I would say the biggest sort of change for me was like my own sort of self-confidence. I didn't feel like I don't have to prove myself anymore, which is always kind of nice. And it's something that I've struggled with as a self-taught coder with some imposter syndrome. So for me, it's been a good sort of confidence booster. But, as far as like ready to, sit back and relax, I don't get that feeling at all. I'm actually very excited about my next story and future stories going forward.
And what are you doing right now?
So for my next story, I got a grant funding from USC in their National Health Fellowship program. And so I'm going to be doing a story about, we're looking at point pollution, and specifically we're looking at old historic online landfills. And then the impact on well water users and other folks in the community nearby.
All right. Do we have questions from the audience? We have a question in the back from Professor Dash. The question is, how long did the executives at Gopher Industries know that they were poisoning their own workers?
They knew for a long time. The regulations, the OSHA standards, had been in place for decades, and as part of the standards, they have to do quarterly monitoring of the lead levels, and their own data is what we built the entire investigation off of. In fact, we even got some consultant reports where the consultants had blatantly said, you need to make these fixes because you're outside of what the standards allow. Yeah.
Any possibility of criminal, I'm repeating this for folks on Zoom, any possibility of criminal charges?
It doesn't look like there will be. At the time, the U.S. rep had had called on DOJ and OSHA and EPA to all investigate. And the last I heard from that rep was that it seems like DOJ was waiting to see where OSHA and EPA investigations led to, which are at this point, they're still sort of arguing over them. So
we have a question from one of our students, Isabella.
Yeah, how do you consistently find passion in HBCU rather than getting caught up in the
How do you find passion in your work rather than getting caught up in the day-to-day?
That's good. So for me, I always have like a few projects going, and so I've always got something that I want to work on, and so I kind of drip feed that to myself as a little treat after I've been doing my more boring work. So read a few scientific studies I don't want to read, and then maybe do a little coding, and that's sort of how I work through it myself.
You relax by coding.
I do, yeah.
Oh, we have a question from our webinar audience.
We do. Ethan Simmons from the News Gazette wants to know what for you was the hardest part of creating this series of stories, and what phase of the reporting made you most uncomfortable?
Could you say that one more time?
What for you was the hardest part of creating this series of stories, and what phase of the reporting made you most uncomfortable?
What was the hardest part and what made you most uncomfortable?
The hardest part was the fact that it was a private company and we couldn't get inside of it. So all of our reporting had to be sourced, and because of that, it also meant that all of our reporting had to be verified in other ways as well. So that just takes a lot of time to do. That was probably the hardest part of it, and why this story took 2 years over, say, 6 months. If we could have just FOIA'd the records, it probably would have been quicker. The hardest part, the most uncomfortable part, for me, the most uncomfortable part is I'm not really good at talking with people, so I kind of get in my head a little bit. I have some anxiety with it, and so the idea of like going out and knocking on some guy's door and asking him to like talk crap about his boss like terrified me. And really, the solution to get through it was to just every time Corey invited me out, say yes. And that's what I did.
Face your fears, right?
Absolutely.
Any other questions? We have a question from Matt.
When working in a team with 2 other reporters, how did you make sure communication was flowing and you guys didn't either get too far away from the project or start overlapping each other?
The question is how the collaboration worked in terms of communication, maybe workflow, making sure that the machine worked well together and didn't get gummed up.
That's a fantastic question, because I think it's something that the Tampa Bay Times does really well. And whenever I'm talking with other reporters about how we do their projects, they go, "Oh, I wish we did that at our paper." So here's what I would say to you. When we divvy up our tasks, we have a weekly meeting where we go over all of the goals that we want to get done this week. We divvy them up on who's going to do them, and then we just let that person go. They don't need someone watching them while they do their work. And then we meet up again at the end of the week to go over what we found out, and then find the next tasks for the next week and divvy them up. And for this story, where Rebecca wrote essentially all of it and Corey and I just fed her reporting, it was key that we would write up memos about different topics. And that's how we work a lot in the Tampa Bay Times. While something's fresh in your head, write a memo on it, right? Maybe 1 page, 2 pages on some fact or some bit you've been reporting out, and then just come back to it later, but it's all there for you later. And then when it comes time to draft, you can really start from your memos and pull out a rough draft just off of your memos. And that's a technique that we use.
We have a question from our webinar, and then we'll come over here.
This is from a Times alum from 1964 to 71. How's the Times doing relative to other newspapers?
How is the Tampa Bay Times doing relative to other newspapers?
It's tough. It's a tough industry for everyone right now. The Times hasn't done it. They haven't done terrible. We haven't been bought out by a hedge fund. We're owned by the Poynter Institute, which is a nonprofit journalism education institution. So there's a lot of good things to have there, but there has been some tightening of the belt at the Tampa Bay Times. We trimmed down. We only print 2 days a week now. We don't own our printing press anymore, and just in general, a little tightening of belts around the newsroom. Yeah.
That printing press they took when I was an intern there, that was the first place they took us on orientation, and we toured the printing
Same.
press. Yeah. and it was state of the art at the time.
It was rated for a Cat 5 hurricane, and I got to sleep there when Irma came through. Eleanor did too.
Aaron. Adam.
I also transferred and joined the DI, and I just wanted to ask, like, how did the daily line help you get towards this part of your career?
What role did the DI play in you being where you are now and having done the quality of work that you now do?
The DI was absolutely vital to me getting the internship I got, because clips matter. Clips matter more than anything in this industry. When you get out of college, no one asks you what your GPA was. They want to see your clips. And so the DI is the place where you get to work on your clips. It's where you get to take the stuff you learned in class and apply it. And I strongly recommend all of you guys to at least take one semester and write for the DI and learn a little bit about what it means to have that responsibility to be a beat reporter and have to cover your beat every single day and to go up and talk to strangers every day. And it'll make you a much better reporter, but it'll give you those clips and those are what will get you the internships and the jobs.
Yeah, about that GPA, no one asks your GPA after you graduate. Thank God. I can, based on my personal experience, thank God that question was never asked. We have a question here from, I don't know your name, sir, but go ahead.
I just had a question. Have you ever
Have you felt threatened by any of the folks on the other side of your reporting, the folks that you are in an adversarial relationship with, really?
For this story, no. In the past, I had worked on a story about Scientology, and I was a little bit apprehensive about that one, knowing what they've done to reporters in the past. But I can say that those fears were unfounded. The closest I've ever been to being threatened was working on poison, but it wasn't from the company. It was from someone who owned a business nearby the plant. And I was there doing some reporting, and this guy pulled up in his truck next to me and asked, are you that reporter that's been writing about the factory? And I told him, well, I'm one of the reporters. And he said, well, we don't appreciate you around here. And then he started listing off all the reasons that our story was bunk. And the main reason for him was that the employees were just dirty people and they didn't shower enough, and it was their fault that they were poisoned. And so I, perhaps not so politely, told him why he was wrong and why these workers were destined to be poisoned in a place where the lead levels were more than their respirators could protect against. And so after that exchange, I started to walk off, and he said to me, well, where your car's parked, there's a lot of traffic, so I'm just letting you know I'm not going to be responsible if anything happens to your car. And that was about as threatened as I've ever been, and fortunately, I didn't find that too threatening.
Could you share a little bit about the equipment that the company was giving the workers to allegedly protect themselves from this hazard?
Yeah, I wish I had the more specific numbers in my head so that I could give you guys like a sense of it. But the basic level of respirator protected to about 2,500 micrograms per cubic meter of lead. And these people were regularly facing stuff in the 20,000 to 30,000, sometimes up to 100,000. And they had a respirator that protected against 2,500. There's a more powerful version of that, which protects, I think it's 10 times or 100 times more protective maybe. But of those respirators, they owned only 4 of those powerful ones. So the vast majority of employees were using those ones that weren't going to protect them from the levels of lead we were seeing inside the factory.
All right, we're going to wrap up. Thank you to the Franks for making this possible. Thank you for Colleen for being the executive producer and making this possible. Thank you for everyone for showing up. Thank you, Eli, for doing this work, important work, inspirational work, and come back and see us.
Thanks for having me.